Welcome back. So, I want to talk about playoff format. Playoff format comes up a lot in comments. I've talked about this before, but it's always kind of fun to look at because there will always be the I want 1 versus 8. Okay? We should have 1 versus 16 comes up every now and then. The NHL's not going to go for that. So, what I've got on the board is the playoff matchups as they would currently be. So, in the Atlantic, you have Boston as the number 2 wild card staying in that division. And playing against Florida in the first round, you have Toronto and Tampa in the first round. And those matchups look fantastic. In the Metro, you have the Rangers leading the division currently. The Washington Capitals are the number 1 wild card, so they would play against the Rangers. We know how those series are usually fantastic. And you have Carolina and Pittsburgh in the other matchups. So all 4 of these, you can print money with how entertaining these series would be, honestly. So I'm going to skip over this and go over here because that's always the argument of, I like 1 versus 8. Okay, 1 versus 8 is Florida versus Boston. 2 versus 7, because the division leader, division winner, is your number 2 seed in a 1 versus 8, 2 versus 7 setup. You have the Rangers against the Capitals. The only matchups that change are Tampa Bay now plays Pittsburgh instead of Toronto. I don't know that Tampa Bay would prefer that matchup. And Carolina gets Toronto instead of Pittsburgh. So that's what changes. Other than that, everything stays the same. There's no change. The Central Division. So we're going to go out west. And then I'll come back to this and discuss it. Colorado's currently the leader of the division. They would play the number 2 wild card because they have the better record. So San Jose switches over to end up playing in the Central as the number 2 wild card with a 550 points percentage. And I only mention the points percentage here because they're a little bit better than Anaheim. And it shows too, like in the East you need a 657, a 654, and in the West you need a 550 or a 671 because the Central's pretty darn good. So yeah, the Pacific and issues there are still there. So you'd have Colorado against San Jose in the first round. They've played in the playoffs before. You have St. Louis and Nashville. That would be a very entertaining matchup, as we saw with last night's game between those two same teams. Then in the Pacific, you have Vegas in a rematch with the Minnesota Wild. And you have LA and Anaheim, a Battle of California right there. Now, if we went 1 versus 8, it would be Colorado against San Jose. 2 versus 7, it does change. Vegas now gets Anaheim instead of Minnesota. 3 versus 6 becomes St. Louis against LA. 4 versus 5 becomes Nashville and the Minnesota Wild. So the matchups do change a lot in the West. They don't change as much in the East. But I guess the question then becomes one of, are these better matchups? Or are these better matchups? If I am buying ad space, I would think that I would prefer a St. Louis-Nashville matchup to a St. Louis-LA. And definitely prefer some of these matchups. But is Vegas versus Minnesota a bigger cash grab for advertisers, or Nashville, Minnesota? Because when the NHL went to this system, it was about rivalries. Networks wanted to sell rivalries. Also, they didn't like that with the 1 versus 8 setup. Let's say number 7 scores an upset. You may not know who they're playing in the next round for a while. Whereas in this setup, you can hype up who they're going to play in the next round because you know who it's between. So if let's say Carolina sweeps Pittsburgh, they're either playing the Rangers or Washington in the next round. Pretty easy to market, right? Whereas the other system, you don't really know. Sometimes we didn't know until a couple of days before the next round got started, which apparently networks weren't a big fan of. And the NHL definitely likes those network dollars. Now, if we did a crazy over-the-top 1 versus 16, the NHL completely loses it. They say, all right, we're going to go. Now, the thing with that is you have to have a balanced schedule. The last time that we did this was in 1980 and 1981. It was when the WHA came in. And so every team in the league played every other team in the league 4 times. There was 21 teams. You play every team 4 times. That's 80 games. Works out perfect. So they hated it. It went for 2 years, and they hated it and couldn't wait to switch back to divisional because you get baffling matchups. 1980, Vancouver plays Philly in the first round. 1981, they played Buffalo in the first round. So it didn't work out in that way. In that, in your first round, now you're going all the way across the continent, which was more difficult then than it is now. likely more of a hindrance then than it is now, but still, they don't really want to do it. So if there's a 1 versus 16, right away you get Florida versus San Jose, and that's one coast to the other. You get Tampa Bay versus Anaheim, one coast versus the other. Now, you do have 2 Florida teams and 2 California teams. Might be some marketability there. 3 versus 14 is the Rangers in LA, one coast versus the other. So, again, NHL owners would never go for this. So this is just strictly me looking at it and going, this is kind of fun. It's never going to happen. 4 versus 13 is then Colorado versus Boston. 5 versus 12 is Carolina versus the Minnesota Wild. 6 versus 11 becomes Toronto and Vegas, which I have to say would be a lot of fun to watch. That series would be so much fun to watch. You have Toronto, which of course is considered kind of the mecca of Canada, and whether we agree or disagree, it is considered to be, and it is the biggest fan base in Canada. Then you have Vegas, which is this big flashy city in the States that's got this idea that they're going to be Stanley Cup champions in their first 5 years. There's a lot there, I think, to work with the series, and it's the one that when I was putting this together, I thought, now that would be fun. There are reasons for other ones, too, to be fun as well. So Pittsburgh against Nashville. They met in the finals in 2017, and St. Louis and Washington would, I think, actually be a pretty excellent first-round series. That's 8 versus 9, whereas Pittsburgh and Nashville are 7 versus 10. So, for Florida on this board, you get Boston or you get Boston. In the traditional 1 versus 8, or what we're doing now, which is divisional, which is even more traditional than 1 versus 8. The difference being we now have wild cards rather than 1 versus 4, 2 versus 3 in each division. I wouldn't have even necessarily minded if they did 1 versus 4, 2 versus 3. I understand why they don't. They understand that some divisions are going to be better than others, and so the wild card setup is so that you can have 5 teams from one division and 3 from the other, which can happen. It's not happening right now, but it could. We could still see 4 Central Division teams above the line. And we could see just the 3 Pacific, but that's a debate for a whole other time. So for Florida, I think they would prefer playing San Jose to playing Boston right now. I do. Tampa Bay, I think between Toronto, Pittsburgh, or Anaheim. I think they'd take Anaheim right now. Anaheim's been having a hard time lately. Toronto and Pittsburgh, to me, is kind of a pick'em. I know people will talk about how, well, Pittsburgh would be the one that you really wouldn't want to play, but Pittsburgh hasn't won a round since 2018. So, with them being out in the first round in 2019, losing the play-in round in 2020, and being out the first round in 2021, I don't know that they have that same air of, a fear around the league that you might think that they would have, say, in 2016 or 2017. And Toronto, of course, they haven't won a round in a long time. So, yeah, that's where we're at with that. Then you get to the Metro. You've got the Rangers. Their choice would be either the Capitals or the Capitals and LA here. I don't know that they would choose LA over the Capitals right now. The Capitals have been having problems lately. LA's looked really pretty good, other than last night when they got Timo Meier. But, yeah, I don't know that the Rangers wouldn't want to say, you know what, we'll just take the Caps then. It seems like that's what the universe wants for us. Carolina, you got a choice between Pittsburgh or Toronto. So it is a matchup that Tampa Bay would have that debate with as well, right? Because Pittsburgh and Toronto are the only ones that flip here. And then otherwise, if you're Carolina, your choice is Minnesota. Between Pittsburgh and Minnesota, I don't know. I don't know which one's the easier matchup. And I always find it interesting because in the end, people want to see the worst team against the best team in terms of that first round. And we're now in a league where 16 out of 32 teams make it. Team 16 is pretty good. So there aren't really bad teams that make the playoffs anymore. That should no longer be a thing. There will be years where a team that's below the playoff line in one conference might have been above the playoff line in the other conference. But in general, we really shouldn't see bad teams in the playoffs. So for Carolina, it's interesting because, again, they have some games in hand on the Rangers. Not worried about that here. I wasn't going to do it just by points percentage. I thought it'd be fun just to look at it from a perspective of, so if the playoffs started today kind of thing. So now if we look out west, you've got Colorado who get San Jose here. They also get San Jose here. They get Boston in a 4 versus 13 matchup. Again, I'm going to go out on a limb and say they'd likely if they were honest, prefer San Jose. No team will ever come out and say, we'd actually like to play that team instead. The Southern Pro Hockey League has a system where the top team can choose who they want to play in the first round. I think that would be a minefield if the NHL ever did that. Okay, Florida, you finished first. Who you want in the first round? We'd like Toronto. Just imagine the anger for Leaf fans, for the Leafs, if that was a thing, or if they came out, we think we can beat Tampa. We want Tampa in the first round. What? So, if we had a setup like that where you could choose, and I know it's not that freewheeling, but yeah, I think that would be fun. It'll never happen. St. Louis's choices are Nashville. They also have LA in there and the Capitals. So between the three, I think they'd actually prefer the 8 versus 9 matchup with the Capitals. The interesting thing is that last night's game with Nashville with St. Louis, I think, shows that they're very close to one another in terms of ability, talent, and playing style. And over a 7-game series, I think it would go the full 7. A playoff matchup right now between St. Louis and LA. I don't underrate LA. I think LA could be very dangerous in the playoffs. It is increasingly looking like LA's probably a playoff team, and that is something that will make the playoffs quite interesting in the Pacific, because the Pacific is the weakest of the 4 divisions. So LA may have home ice and maybe a team that would just be a wild card, maybe even a number 2 wild card when the season's finished, right? In the East. So for Vegas's choices as the winner of the Pacific would be Minnesota. Here they would get Anaheim. And in this setup, they actually end up being the 11th ranked team. They end up being on the road against Toronto. So they wouldn't want to pick Minnesota right now. Even though they beat Minnesota last year in the playoffs, I don't think Minnesota would be their pick. I kind of get the feeling that Anaheim would definitely be that pick. Even though a Toronto-Vegas matchup would be one I'd absolutely love, I think Vegas and Anaheim would be the one that they would want. Now, LA and Anaheim, that's your highway series. We've seen that before. That could be great hockey. It can be very intense. These teams could have really a great 7-game series. Now, for LA, here they'd be Team 14 and they'd be on the road playing in New York against the Rangers. You wouldn't want that. And here they'd be on the road as Team 6, going in against the 3rd-rated San Jose or St. Louis Blues, again because Vegas gets the number 2 seed as the winner of their division. And that's an argument we had back in the day with the 1 versus 8, 2 versus 7, was that division winners would get a top 2, or when we had 6 divisions, a top 3 seed. And there were definitely discussions at times where the team that was the number 3 seed and had won the division didn't look like they were as good of a team as the ones that were below them, but played in better divisions. So that was always a fun discussion. There is no perfect setup for playoffs, I don't believe. LA would definitely want the freeway setup with Anaheim. And for Anaheim, they'd have a choice between LA, Tampa, or Vegas. So you wouldn't want to be one of the lower rated teams. I think that if you had a 1 versus 16, I think we'd see fewer upsets. I think that with this setup, you're guaranteed to be against teams that you're familiar with. With this setup, you're pretty much guaranteed to be against teams you're mostly familiar with as well. Division rivals, I think you pay more close attention to than necessarily conference rivals. And of course here, it's a mismatch. How many of these would actually be within the same conference? None of them. None of them actually end up being within the same conference. That's interesting. It's interesting that it's West, East, East, West, West, East, West, East, West, West, East, East, West, East, West, East, West. And home ice advantage would be had by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 home ice advantages would belong to Eastern teams out of 8. So that would be a remarkable setup. But again, to make that work, you'd have to have a completely balanced schedule, or at least as close to balanced as you can, meaning every team plays the same games against all the other teams. And if you did a 1 versus 16, and again, it's just me just throwing that out there, I think at that point divisions no longer would be necessary. There'd be no point in having divisions. I remember in the early 80s, again during that as a little kid with hockey and trying to figure out, so why do they have divisions if it's 1 versus 16, 2 versus 15? If every team's playing every other team the same amount of times, who cares what there shouldn't be divisions. So that's one thing that would definitely be a problem. You wouldn't have divisions anymore. It would just be 32 teams, and here or basically it's standings power rankings is what you'd see. So it is interesting to see how these would set up right now. Obviously, this is absolutely in a state of flux. This is going to change. I do think that the top 8 are set in the East. I would be very surprised if anybody in the East actually is able to knock any of these 8 teams out. In the West, I do think there are at least 2 teams in the West that could be overthrown. I think Winnipeg, Calgary, Edmonton, Dallas, all 4 of those teams are capable of putting together runs and ending up in the playoffs. As dark as things may seem in Edmonton, they're still capable. Watch Brendan Perlini. He believes. Just have him become like a motivational speaker for the team, and they'll be fine. But there's definitely room there. And it's interesting, too, because it was 20 games into the season. We were talking about Edmonton as contenders and, in the running for first in the division, and they could run away with it, and Vegas doesn't look that great. And now here we are, not even 20 games later, and they're gone. They're out. And I'm not really talking about them now other than, they could end up in the playoffs, I guess. So, yeah, that's how quickly things can change. So, I know that people do prefer the 1 versus 8 format, but I don't know that it would change any of the results. I don't know that it would make a big difference to the results. People will point out, you would end up with Colorado and St. Louis as potentially your second-round matchup here. Here, if Colorado wins, odds are they'd probably get Nashville or Minnesota in the next round if Vegas and St. Louis won their matchup. So instead of St. Louis ending up against Colorado in round 2, they would end up probably against Vegas in round 2, which would seem more winnable. But seeming more winnable, I learned in the conference final or conference formats too that it unless you've played the games, there's no way to tell, right? It is a league right now where I think the Parity's the best that it's ever been, which is part of the reason why on Saturday nights when I do power rankings video, I know people are going to get mad because these teams are very close, and it can be really tough to try to figure out which team's playing better on any given day, any given week, and it can change very, very quickly. So there you go. Just a fun look at the playoff standings, where we're at right now, and what would be different if you changed from the wild card to 1 versus 8. And again, remembering that your second seed is also a division winner. And if they just went crazy and said, we'll just have Team 1 versus Team 16. And I left out the idea of play-ins, which I know the NHL has at least on some level thought about, where teams 7, 8, 9, and 10 in each conference would have like either a single game, so 7 versus 10, 8 versus 9, either a single game to determine those final 2 playoff spots, or maybe a best 2 out of 3. But that's for a whole other time, and I really kind of hope they don't do it. I like the playoffs how they are now. I like the idea of the 1 versus 8, 2 versus 7, if they go that way, if they ever go back to it, or the setup we have now. As you see, I don't think it makes a huge difference other than what matchups you may see in the next round. But yeah, I think that it's never too early to start discussing these things. And we're right around where the halfway point of the season was supposed to be. So here we are. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, which format you like best and which matchups you think would be the most fun to watch if the playoffs started tomorrow. For me, I think, honestly, all 8 of these would be great. I think all 8 of these would be great, even though Anaheim's been going through a tough time recently. And this series between LA and Anaheim might be seen as, well, we can skip that for a lot, especially on the East Coast. Nobody's watching it. Staying up, I would be very entertained. California series are brutal. These teams do not like one another, and they can get very physical and very ugly very quickly. So a lot of fun to watch. Probably a lot of fun to play in, too. Let me know your thoughts, which series matchups you'd enjoy the most and all that. And, yeah, let me know your thoughts about the format you think would be best. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I'll talk to you again soon.